this is a coding challenge we're going to do. We're given this object here, which is a record collection. Each record has an ID, and then it also has different pieces of information about the record. They don't all have the same information, but see, we have album, artist, tracks, album, artist, tracks. This just says artist, tracks, and this just has album here. And we are supposed to create this update records function where we can pass in the ID, the property, and the value, and it's going to update our record collection with the property and the value. So for instance, if we pass in the ID 2468 and we put the property artist, and if we set a different value like Quincy or something like that, then we should update this whole object so now it says Quincy instead of Prince. And we should return the full collection. So it's going to update the collection and then return the collection. If we have an empty string for the value, it should just completely delete that property. Also, if we have the property of tracks and then we have a value, instead of updating the whole tracks here with what we put in, it's just going to add the track to the end of this array. So if you look right here, it says, the comment says, keep a copy of the collection for tests. This JSON.parse and JSON.stringify and then collection, this is just a fancy way in JavaScript to make a copy of the object. Remember, in our function, we are going to be changing the collection object, but we want to have a copy of the original object before anything was changed. So that's what that's for. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're just updating this function here, this update records function. Okay, so let's get to this. So we'll do if value equals blank, because the first condition we are going to test for is if we need to delete the property. Remember, if the value is set to blank, we delete that property. So if the value is blank, we are going to delete collection, and then we have to use bracket notation, ID, and then prop. The collection ID prop, that's the collection here. If we pass in the ID 1248, it would go to there. The property, if we pass in album for the property, it would go to here, and then it would just delete that whole thing if our value is an empty string. Okay, the next condition we have to look for is if the property is tracks, because for most properties, we're just going to override that property with the value passed into the function. But if the property is tracks, we are going to push onto the end of the array. So let's do an else if. Else if prop equals tracks, then we just have to push on to the end of the array. So there's also another condition here, which is if the tracks property is empty. If the tracks property is empty, we need to create it. Here's a fancy way to do that. Collection ID props. So if prop equals tracks, we're going to set the tracks, because remember, prop is going to equal tracks. We're going to set the tracks to equal. It's going to either equal itself if it exists, or if it doesn't exist, we're going to create it. I'll show you how. Collection ID prop, it's going to equal itself, or that's the or operator, it's going to equal an empty array. So if this already exists, we're going to set it to equal itself. But if itself doesn't exist, we'll just set it to equal an empty array. So that's just a way to create that property if it doesn't already exist. So now that we know it exists, we can just push the value to the end of the array. Collection ID prop, and we'll just do the dot push and then put in the parentheses the value. So we're able to push the value that was passed into this function onto the end of the array. Okay, there's only one last condition, which is the kind of the default condition, else. So if the value isn't blank and the property isn't tracks, then we just push the value onto the property. Then we just set the property to equal the value, just like this. Collection ID prop equals value. Okay, let's test this out. So we already have this example down here, but to see if it actually worked, we're going to do a console.log so we can see the output there. And if I run that, let me open up the console so you can really see it. So let's see what we changed. Go to 5439 and we set the artist, which didn't previously exist, to ABBA. So let's look down here. In the console, 5439, and the artist is ABBA. Let's see what happens when we add a track. So we'll do one more example here. I'll just put it right above here. Update records, and I'm going to pass in something. I'll pass in, let's see, the ID 2468, and we'll pass in the key, which is going to be tracks, and then for the value, we'll put test. So let's see what happens here. If we run that, it's going to update the record here, and then it's going to update the record again, but we don't care about that one. We mainly care that it's going to console.log what the final value is. So if we look at 2468 here, 2468, let's see the tracks. We got 1999, Little Red Corvette, and Test. So it's working. Great.